Welcome, church family. My name is Brian, and I'm one of the pastors here on staff. And I just want to say, man, I wish you guys could be in the room. But I'm so thankful that you get to join us this way, and just confident that God continues to move in our hearts and in our lives. And I'm also confident of this, that we will look back at this season less with a feeling of loss, but I feel like God keeps telling me we're going to look back at this season more with a feeling of joy of what God has been doing in our lives and in our communities in this world. So I'm just confident of that. But thanks for joining us in this way. Remember when you were in elementary school and the class would be doing work at all of their desks, and the teacher would be slowly walking around the classroom watching each of the students work? And remember that feeling in your gut then when the teacher came up behind you, stood right there, looked over your shoulder, and you might even have a mental image of what that teacher looked like, and maybe that teacher looks a little bit angry or a little bit scary. I have a picture here just to kind of give you that, what you might think that looks like, something to make you kind of get the chills a little bit like that. But you had this nervous feeling, this anxiousness would rise up in you, this panic feeling. Or maybe taking your driver's test, and if you took it like I did mine, you had the driver's instructor in the car with you, and you went out on this course, and you're driving and stopping and starting and turning left and right, and you notice the driver's instructor keeps writing things in their little notebook. That same feeling in your gut. And the adult equivalent of that feeling is when the boss randomly calls you into their office and they say, "Hey, can we talk for just a minute?" And it's that same feeling no matter how old we are. Whatever confidence we had just disappears. Nervousness increases as the effectiveness of our deodorant decreases. We start sweating. We get anxious. We begin to question our everything. We begin to ask, what is it that I'm doing wrong? Because we know we're doing something wrong. We're just not exactly sure what it is. It's our default setting in those moments with authority. It's when we wish we could be invisible. It's when we wish we could hide. And it's interesting that that's our response. Because really, the people there are there to help us, to guide us, to direct us. But all we really see is correction and judgment. And this can also be our response when it comes to the presence of God. And I know I can land in this place as well. I have this idea that if God were standing next to me, he wouldn't even so much be next to me, he'd be behind me just a little bit. And what he'd be doing first and foremost is be pointing out what I'm doing wrong in my life. Why else would God be so close to me? If I was doing things right, God would give me some space and he'd go work on people that needed his help a lot more than I did. And I have this sense when it comes to the presence of God, I can view God as more judgmental than redemptive. And I want to talk about that idea, that understanding of God. As a matter of fact, I want to push on that a little bit here in this message, because I believe that a true understanding of the presence of God moves us from panic to peace. If we truly understood the presence of God, we would make a move from panic to peace. God is always inviting us out of our anxious thoughts. God is always inviting us out of our hiding and into his presence. And in his presence, we find peace and we find wholeness, because his presence is purposefully redemptive. We're to be a non-anxious presence in an anxious world. And so we're going to continue on in our series called Presence. Steve kicked us off last week, and he talked about how God's presence is the fuel in our tanks. It's what we move in. It's what we move with. And he said that Hollywood's going to make better movies. Nashville's going to make better music. Broadway's going to make better shows. Wall Street's going to make more money. Corporate America is going to build bigger buildings. But we don't move in those things. We move in the presence of God. And he said this, I think, which is great. He said, the one thing that will always set us apart from the rest of the people on this planet, the one thing that will cause eyebrows to rise, heads to turn, and knees to bow, is the tangible, manifest presence of God. What the world needs desperately in the church today are people of the presence. But does our understanding of the presence of God draw us toward him, or are we pushed away from his presence? We're going to be in Psalm 139. So if you have your Bibles, you can turn there with me. And this is a beautiful, well-known psalm. And I think a lot of times we go to the psalm when we need encouragement, when we want something to come alongside and make us feel a little bit better about ourselves. But it really depends on the understanding that we have of who God is. Now, this psalm is broken down into four sections, of 6 verses each. It's 24 verses long. We're gonna go through these sections. But as we do, I want us to watch the progression that happens. It's really a movement. It's a movement from panic to peace. It's a movement from isolation to invitation. It's a movement from apprehension and anxiety into assurance. And so we're just gonna read this familiar passage. He says, "O Lord, you have examined my heart and know everything about me." David begins, God, you've searched my heart. You know me, and not just my heart, God, all of me, my passive and active life, my subconscious, my thought life, everything. God, you have searched me. And at the beginning of this chapter, we see that this is uninvited. David did not ask God to do this. God does not need our permission to do this. But hang on to that thought for later on in this passage. God, you've searched me and you know me. It says this, you know when I sit down or stand up. You know my thoughts even when I'm far away. You see me when I travel and when I rest at home. You know everything I do. You know what I'm going to say even before I say it, Lord. You go before me and follow me. You place your hand of blessing on my head. And David begins by showing us the omni God, the omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent God, the God who knows everything, who is all powerful, and who is always with us, the God who is ever present, the presence of God. God sees us all the time, knows all of our thoughts, knows the words before they come out of our mouths, which is great because a lot of times we don't know the words till they come out of our mouths, and we spend a lot of time trying to stuff them back in or dealing with the consequences of those words. He's before us, he's behind us, he places his hand of blessing upon us, and David is processing here the omni God. And he says this in verse 6, "Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too great for me to understand." Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. And this isn't just a trite, oh, isn't God wonderful? It's this idea that this is incomprehensible, that this is beyond me. It's actually a phrase that's rooted in difficulty. He's saying this is a hard truth. Because that phrase can either mean God's acts of judgment or his redemption. So he's saying this could be a good thing, God, that you're this kind of God, or this could be a bad thing. You could be for me or you could be against me. You could be judgmental or you could be redemptive. And so David literally says, this is too much for me. It's beyond me. My mind is blown by what this is. This omni God honestly can feel scary. Right? God knows my thoughts. He sees the real me. He sees the ugly me. I never have a moment without him. It can feel sometimes suffocating. It can feel sometimes confining, especially if we live our lives thinking that we're the ultimate authority. If we get to call the shots in our own lives, if we get to make the decisions, then the omni God is invasive. He's almost traumatic. God knows all of me. He's all powerful. He's always there right beside me, watching me. I can remember in Sunday school growing up where the teacher of the class said, God's always there right beside you. And it sounded vaguely like a threat. It's kind of the same way that we scare kids with Santa Claus. When we say, he sees you when you're sleeping, he knows when you're awake. And we sing that song to kids so that they will behave, right? And this is what David's processing here. And we need to process it as well because our relationship with God depends on this understanding. Do we see God as judgmental or do we see him as redemptive, as freeing us? What grid are we seeing God through? And David says, this is just wonderful. This is big. This is hard. This is difficult. It blows my mind. And then he immediately jumps into talking about hiding. right? God is omnipresent, and he's saying we can't hide. I can never escape from your spirit. I can never get away from your presence. The impulse to hide is as old as the beginning of Scripture. It's as old as the garden. And the same phrase that's used here is used of Jonah when he's fleeing from God as well. If I go up to heaven, you are there. If I go down to the grave, you are there. If I ride the wings of the morning, he's saying as dawn breaks and light bursts out and goes from horizon to horizon at the speed of light. If I could travel the speed of light, if I dwell by the farthest oceans, even there your hand will guide me and your strength will support me. And he has this moment of, yep, you will support me, but he goes right back into hiding. If I could ask the darkness to hide me and the light around me to become night, but even in darkness I cannot hide from you. To you, the night shines as bright as day. Darkness and light are the same to you. God's presence is clearly on display here and here and here, everywhere. No matter where I go, God's there. And I think we find an interesting paradox in this part of the scripture. I think it exposes a contradiction we live with, because the desire we have to hide is also mixed with the desire we have to be known. And I believe that we want the presence of God in our lives, but too often we want the presence of God in our lives on our own terms. We want to make decisions, and we want God's presence and hand of blessing to kind of come behind those decisions. We've elevated our freedom of choice to an unhealthy level, and so we want to make God come alongside that, kind of behind us. It's as if we want his presence and his voice, but we want our voice to be even louder. I think another way we want God on our own terms is we desperately want to be seen and known, but not completely. We don't want to be seen and known completely. We want to have control over the parts of us that are seen and known. Because what if someone knew the true us? The selfish us, the inconsistent us, the prideful, the petty, the spiteful parts, the hypocrisy, the thoughts that we have that sometimes scare even us. What if someone knew those thoughts? And this is part of what makes us panic, because this is part of this identity issue that we have. What if someone knew all of that? You see, we're afraid to be completely seen because we will feel unlovable. We believe that we'll be unlovable if we are completely seen. And so no wonder it's our impulse to hide and get away, because God could be redemptive, but he could also be judgmental. And so that's why we stuff things down in our lives, and that's why we lock things in the closet of our lives, and that's why we turn up the noise in our lives so loud that we don't have to deal with certain parts. So if I don't have to deal with it, God doesn't have to deal with it, other people don't have to deal with it, maybe I'll be more lovable. Even though we know that this doesn't solve anything. As a matter of fact, it only causes the panic to rise. Several years ago, I was playing hide and seek with my youngest daughter, and it was her turn to count. And so I went into our hall closet. It's really just shelves. It's a door and a bunch of shelves. So I took everything off of the bottom on the floor there and put it on other shelves. And if I tightened up into the tightest ball I could crawl in underneath the bottom shelf. And so I pulled the door, and I didn't mean to latch it, but I pulled it closed and it latched. And then all of a sudden, as soon as it latched, I started to panic. I started to sweat. I started to kind of hyperventilate, and all I could think about was stretching my legs, and all I could think about was, I'm going to have to break this door down. I have to get out of here. This is horrible. And so I start banging on the door, hoping that my daughter will come, and I'm banging and I'm banging. And finally, she opens the door and she looks down at me and she goes, "You're not very good at this, Dad." I was so absolutely panicked. And that's what hiding does to us. The more we try and hide, the more we try and get away, it just creates more panic in our lives. It creates more anxiety in our lives. Hiding doesn't work. We can't do it anyway. Sometimes I think that we try and solve this problem by just not believing anymore. I think some people just think, well, I'm just not going to believe in God. And that way I can kind of mentally walk away from his presence. We don't see the freedom. We don't see the upholding. We don't see the guiding, the sustaining hand. We just see the suffocating. We see the judgment. And hiding becomes more important to us than health and hope and healing and wholeness. And David knows he can't hide even if he wanted to, and that's a good thing because God's pursuing us. He's not abandoning us, and we're getting to this part where we find out that the omnipresent God is for us. And we're getting to this movement, this progression. And look at verse 13. He says, you made all the delicate inner parts of my body and knit me together in my mother's womb. Thank you for making me so wonderfully complex. Your workmanship is marvelous. How well I know it. You watched me as I was being formed in utter seclusion, as I was woven together in the dark of the womb. You saw me before I was born. Every day of my life was recorded in your book. Every moment was laid out before a single day had passed. How precious are your thoughts about me, O God. They cannot be numbered. I can't even count them. They outnumber the grains of sand. And when I wake up, you are still with me. This idea that God is for us, that he was intimately involved in our creation. He helped create our bodies, and not just our bodies, but our inmost being. It wasn't just our frame, it's who we are. It's our minds, it's our unique gifts, our hopes, our aspirations, our very identity. And that's such a beautiful picture. Something outside of us created us, and something outside of us even sustains us. Can you imagine if we had to tell our hearts to beat, or our lungs to breathe, or our pancreas to do whatever it is that pancreases do? But God sustains us, and it says, God, your workmanship is marvelous. And this is true for all of us. All of us are inherently and immeasurably valuable. All people are the marvelous workmanship of our great God. And then he gets to verse 17 and he says, God, your thoughts are precious. God, you think good thoughts towards me. And how I value that. He says, really he's saying, God, greater than all the wealth in the world is being known by you and seen by you and thought of by you. And God, you do it all of the time because that is who you are. You see, I think our assumption is if God really knew everything about me and he was with me all of the time, he wouldn't really like me. Or he would use my failure against me, because the person that has information on you has power over you. And we see that a lot of times in God. At least that's what we project on him, but that is not who God is. God's thoughts are not like our thoughts. He sees past things that we can't see past. He forgives things that we wouldn't even forgive in our own way. His thoughts are pure. God is for us. The omni-God is for us. Look what we see in this passage that tells us about his character. He places his hand of blessing upon us. He guides us. His strength supports us. He enlightens us. He crafted us. We have his undivided attention. His thoughts of us are pure. He truly sees us. He is always present with us. God uses all of his knowledge, all of his power, all of his presence for us, not against us. And this is incredibly amazing and liberating. And another beautiful thing about the way God thinks is God does not have our short attention span. He's not distracted as easily as we are. His thoughts are eternal. From everlasting to everlasting, God has been thinking of us. God has been thinking purely of us. He always has been thinking these loving thoughts, and he always will be thinking these loving thoughts. We have his undivided attention. And it's not just that he's thinking about us, he's able to do on our behalf immeasurably more than we could ask or even imagine. The omnipotent God who truly sees who we are, who truly knows who we are, is powerful and gracious enough to move on our behalf. And we need to anchor ourselves to these truths. We need to anchor ourselves to the fact that God's presence is redemptive and not judgmental in our lives. When I was little, I used to spend a lot of time on my grandparents' farm, and one time we were there with our family, and it just rained and rained and rained for several days and started flooding, and it kind of washed out one of the roads right by the house. And so my oldest brother and I decided that we were going to walk from one of these kind of peaks down through where all the flood was rushing through to the other side, because we apparently didn't have anything better to do, so that's what we thought we'd do. So he's 5 years older than I am, and always quite a bit bigger. So the water was up to here on me and probably up to here on him. And so as we started walking through, the current started to push me sideways, and it started to kick my feet up. So I just grabbed onto his arm. And he kept walking in a straight direction through this awful, muddy, gunky water. And I was just getting kicked sideways all the time. But I knew that as long as he was hanging on to me, really, I wasn't going anywhere. I was anchored to somebody who was going to make it through. And I just so believe that the world's constantly trying to wash us away and push us sideways and put us in this state of panic and anxiety and this identity crisis. And yet, an understanding of God, anchoring ourselves to the truth that God is for us, will move us from panic to peace. And in this last section, we see that he's inviting God into his life. Now, I'll be honest with you. There's some verses here that seem like they go sideways. And it seems like they don't fit in this entire passage. And oftentimes when people preach from Psalm 139, they just skip this part. And I know I've done that to myself. But we're going to read it all. Here's verse 19. "Oh God, if you would only destroy the wicked, get out of my life, you murderers. They blaspheme you. Your enemies misuse your name. Oh Lord, shouldn't I hate those who hate you? Shouldn't I despise those who oppose you? Yes, I hate them with total hatred, for your enemies are my enemies." And it seems like David is doing all this beautiful stuff about who God is, and then he starts ranting and hating on people. But the reality is this: David has just had this encounter with the omni-God. He's just seen God for who he is and all of his holiness. And so wicked people who would boast in the presence of this God, in full view of this God, are intolerable to David. And really, it's just indicative of David's zeal for God in this passage. And he doesn't say, "God, put it in my hands and let me wipe them out." He just says, "God, this is super frustrating to me when I know who you are and people don't, and people who push against you." And so that's what he says. But then we come to this transformational passage. We come to the secret of Psalm 139 is found in verses 23 and 24. He acknowledges God for who he is. He tells God that there's a tendency to hide. He's spoken seminal truths, and then we get to this. He says, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. Point out anything in me that offends you, and lead me along the path of everlasting life." And I love that. He invites God in completely. He invites the presence of God. In verse 1, he says, "God, you've searched me," and it was uninvited. At the end of this psalm, the movement that we see is he's saying, "God, I know you're going to love me for who I am. And so I want you to see me." And do we think that way? I talked earlier about teachers, and remember when you'd go into class, let's say in high school, and there was reading to do or an assignment that you had to do, and you didn't do it. And when you got into class, your number one goal was never make eye contact with the teacher. Your whole goal was to be looking away. Anytime they looked around the room, you pretended like you were working very studiously at your desk because you did not want to be seen, because you knew that you were lacking. David knows that he's lacking, but he wants to be completely seen because he's completely confident that he is completely loved. His understanding of the presence of God has moved him from panic to peace. And so he says, "God, know me, search me, test me, grow me, point out things that are wrong. Help me with this anxiousness." You see, God made us. God made our true selves, and so God's presence will not destroy our true selves. It will only take away the things that were never really us to begin with. It's a return to who we were created to be. You see, God will not destroy our identity. He helps us to find our true identity, and David knows this. David knows God's not going to reject him, that God will love him, and so knowing this truth, David's glad to invite the presence of God into his life, and we can be assured as well that God sees us this way. And yes, we are still going to do things wrong. There's still conviction that's going to happen in our lives. Our sin natures, they've been dealt a death blow, but they are still hanging on fiercely in our lives. So we're going to do things wrong. And sometimes the chisel hurts when it's knocking pieces off of us that weren't supposed to be on us, but it is not condemnation. It's conviction, but not condemnation. How does God see us? Colossians 1:22 is beautiful. It says, "Yet now he has reconciled you to himself through the death of Christ in his physical body. As a result, He has brought you into his own presence, and you are holy and blameless as you stand before him without a single fault. And so we need to lean in to that key part of Psalm 139. I have just two handles in closing for you. The first one is just this idea, if you would just ask the question, how does God see me? I mean, if you can picture it right now, if God was sitting in your living room with you, would you be joyful, or would you be running through a mental checklist of things that maybe you've done in the past week or year, and oh man, is he thinking about that? Is he thinking about that thing that I did way back then? Is that how he's seeing me right now? Or would you be extremely excited? I grew up with a fairly legalistic view of God. This idea that if you do the crime, you do the time, and it never goes off your record. And I can remember being in college and sitting in a church service, and the pastor preached on 2 Chronicles 16:9, which is this verse that says that God is looking throughout the earth, seeking to bless people, seeking to strengthen people. And quite honestly, I don't know why that was the time and the place, but it blew me away. And it changed my view, and I remember exactly where I was sitting. I remember that. I've never forgotten that verse, and I always think back to that verse and go, okay, God, that's how you see me. That's what you're trying to do in my life. And so just process this idea, God, how do you see me? And continue to ask him to sharpen that and shape that. And secondly, I would just say this is something that we can do this coming week, is just pray those last two verses. Pray Psalm 139, 23 and 24. And just listen. Listen for him to speak his love over you. Allow him into everything. No more hiding. Open up all the doors. Everything that you've stuffed, God, I want you to see me. I want to be seen completely by you, because I know that I'm loved completely by you. And this understanding of God, this true understanding of his presence, will move us from panic to peace. You see, the goal of all of this life, all of this world, is to one day be in God's presence forever, without interruption. It will be the end of our panic, our anxiety, our identity crisis. It will be the end of tears and suffering and pain, and we will be fully alive in his presence forever. And finally, we will be at perfect peace. Would you pray with me? Jesus, thank you for this psalm. Thank you for these words. I pray that you would continue to speak your love over us. I know you do. I just pray, I guess, that you would open our ears. Open our ears to hear your love. I pray that you would bless us with amazing ears to hear you this week. I pray that you would search us. We invite you into all of our lives, knowing that you love us, knowing that you have the best for us, knowing that that's the best possible version of ourselves. Jesus, we invite you into our lives, and we open up our ears to hear from you. We love you, Jesus, in your name. Amen.